as I go on. What's so important about all this biodiversity? Well, see, here's the thing. Speciation creates biodiversity. Because speciation creates more species, therefore you increase your biodiversity. And what's so important about biodiversity? Well, biodiversity does what we call, or provides us with these things called ecological services. Okay. Whoops. Having a little trouble here. Ecological services. All right. And what I mean by that is it provides us with services. Okay. These are processes by which the environment produces either resources or provides a benefit for us. Okay. Like, for example, a forest creates timber for us. Plants can clean water. All right. And some examples of these ecological services or free services are written down here. They could be water filtration, clean water. It provides groundwater for us to drink. All right, stormwater control, meaning that it reduces erosion. Okay, they can purify the air. We have trees and plants that purify our air. They carry out the nutrients recycling for us, which we know through the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle. They pollinate crops. Biodiversity pollinates crops. We have bees that do all the pollination of all of our fruits around here. Okay, they create soil for us. They reduce floods. You can go on and on and on. They control pests for us in our gardens and stuff. Okay, they provide us food. They provide medicine. Don't forget that. There's just so many things that this biodiversity does for us. So if it's so important, that does so many things for us, then why do we, as humans, reduce the biodiversity of the planet? And that's the point. That all this biodiversity that nature created through all these processes that I've been talking about now for quite a long time, and then we come along and we take away that biodiversity from our planet, and we take away these services. There's just so many different things. Don't forget, half of all our medicines were derived from natural sources. And finally, there's one more I just want to add because I think it's something to be thought about, is that nature and biodiversity has what we call intrinsic value. And all that means is it has value within itself. It's valuable just by itself. For us, it provides aesthetic or cultural value, and I think just that alone says a lot about the need to preserve. But if you want to look at it more terms that of services, okay, that it provides what it provides for us, then you can look at all these ecological services we just talked about. So we need to preserve this biodiversity. All right, now that we know that, we can take it to the next level, and that's what we're going to do here. All right, we talked about this in class, and we're going to continue. Just a quick discussion here in this lecture about wildlife populations, characteristics of populations, how to determine a population. So you have some information about population distributions, can be either uniform, random, or clumped. But how do we calculate the population? We do it two different ways. One is by doing something called a random plot, which I'm going to show you how that works in a minute. And then the second, which we've done and will do in the classroom, would be the mark, return, and recapture technique, which you know maybe as tag and release. And just so you are well informed, that's using this formula where the population equals the number trapped and tagged in the first trapping times how many you trapped later in the last trapping, divided by how many of those in the last trapping had a mark. And we use that to figure out their population. And this one, the tag and release, is used for animals which or we use it for animals because they move. They're the ones that move, and they're hard to keep track of in ecosystem. But if you're talking about plants and things that don't move, it's very easy to do a random plot. And a random plot is a very simple process, and you are all familiar with the concept and the idea, where you would take a whole bunch of triangles, and I ask you how many triangles are there on this page, and you can say, well, I'll do a true census, and I'll start counting them. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, I'm not going to do that because it takes too long. So instead, you can say, all right, I'll do a random plot. And you pick randomly different spaces around. And as you do that, they have to be exactly the same size. So, of course, this is incorrect. But you would do that, average the number in each random plot, multiply that by the number of those plots that are in your whole area, and you should get a population. So if you do that, it would look something like this. You go out into a field, let's say, and oftentimes, to make it more random and more correct, you do it along a line, which you see right here, and that's called a transect line. You should have heard of that before. The transect line provides you with a guide, and so you'll do a plot where he's doing a plot, and then you'll do another one right along that, somewhere up here, and maybe another one somewhere down here, and you'll continue to do those, and then eventually multiply that out, find the average and multiply it out. And that works very well, and that's how you do a random plot. So pretty simple. So what if I want to find how many of those crazy buffaloes are out there? Well, you could do a random plot. And the way you do that is, like they did here, you take a photograph of them, and then you plot them on a map, and then you can count. Okay? And in this case, you would do it randomly. You would count. And you would see that the top map, or the top population count, you can tell right away, has a much higher one than the lower one. Okay? So you know that there's been a decline in the population between those two. All right, and that is just a random plot where you don't sit there and count every single dot. If you had a huge map of this, you would do random plots in here and then count how many there are in each plot and multiply it out. Okay? So that's random plot, and then mark, return, recapture is, of course, the other one, where you use the formula, you tag a creature, all right, because they usually do it with moving species, and then when you recapture them, you can actually find out how many there are by using that formula. Now, let's look at the term ecological niche. A niche is a very, very hard thing to define, and it's a concept that people have a lot of trouble with. If I talked about an ecological niche in terms of habitat and species, you may get the idea, but I think the whole fundamental idea is difficult to comprehend. But it's basically, if you want to define it, all right, it's the role a species plays within the ecosystem, and now that's part of it, but if you look at the diagram, you'll see that doesn't really describe it. Okay, because there's also another factor involved here, and that is that its role in the ecosystem, but also where it's found within the ecosystem. Okay, in other words, where does it fundamentally exist within the ecosystem? So you can almost do the law of limiting factors and say it's within this particular area, and it has a certain role to play in that area. It has to have, in this case, a certain temperature and precipitation range, and that's where it's found. That's its niche. If it's outside the niche, this is what happens. All right, so it's the role it plays within the area in which it survives. Okay, and hopefully that makes sense to you. If you wanted to draw it almost like the law of limiting factors, you would do the same thing. General population, this would be its fundamental niche, whatever this limiting factor is. And then out here you would have stress, where there'd be fewer stress. And in here that you can see the population would decline, Okay, if you move outside of its little niche. Okay, now that niche can be all kinds of different things. All right, so let me try to take you one step further on this. Maybe I can get you to see this next concept. All right, if I drew an organism's ecological niche, sorry about that. Okay, I would say, this range that I'm showing you here is its full range. Okay, and it has a certain niche that it plays. It has certain resources that it takes from the environment. Okay, but if I would take a second species, all right, and drew its ecological niche. All right, let's try this again. Here we go. I drew it like that. You can see there's an overlap. It might be that they're have the same temperature requirement, but it also might mean they have the same food requirement. And where the niches overlap, we have competition. There's competition between these two species. No species likes competition. In fact, there's a rule called the competitive exclusion principle. All right, I'm going to write it up here. It's called the competitive exclusion principle. Okay, that principle, in very simple terms, just says that two species competing for the same limited resources cannot coexist. Two species competing for the same limited resources or limiting resources cannot coexist. All right, competitive exclusion principle, they cannot coexist. So what's going to happen is they're going to diverge, as you can see in this lower chart, and their niche becomes more defined in a smaller range. All right, so you can see how instead of having a much wider range for its niche, it's now more concentrated. All right, and what that does, it creates these things called specialists, which you'll learn about here in a little bit. These specialists, now they have very, very specific niches that they play, very specific roles that they play, and what the reason why they do that is because they were in competition previously with another organism, and they had to change and diverge in their resource use. And so they become specialists, and they specialize in one particular resource. You may have a bird species that, because of this overlap, that have been partitioned, and so the one particular bird species uses only the bottom of the tree, and the other bird species will use the top of the tree. It's been partitioned. Okay, that's an ecological niche. Hopefully that helps a little bit, and you get the idea. A lot of terms, a lot of information, a lot of thinking on this. All right. Next thing with population, moving a little bit away from the ecological niche, is this idea of population growth. All right. Be able to calculate the population growth. In your notes, there's a nice little example of mice, and hopefully, if you look at that example, study it, understand it. All right. I'm going to go through the more general concepts of population growth. If a species is allowed to reach its full biotic potential, and by biotic potential, all right, I mean, this word comes up later too, but as biotic potential, what that means is without anything limiting its ability to reproduce or no limiting factors whatsoever. All right, allow the species to reproduce at maximum rate. We call that the biotic potential, the maximum reproductive rate, without any limiting factors, without anything else bothering it. Unlimited food resources, has everything it needs. If you allow a species to reach its biotic potential, you end up with a population time graph called a J-curve. All All right, this is the famous J curve, where it grows exponentially. A J curve represents exponential growth, so it doubles over time, doubling, 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 and the population growth goes straight up. Now, knowing that, you should be able to see right away that you can't hit infinity in population, therefore this population growth is not sustainable. All right, so a J curve population growth is not sustainable. It's impossible. You can't keep going. And if you look at, example of this, move down to this, the biotic potential of a housefly. Okay, the general housefly that you have at home, a female lays about 120 eggs per generation. Half of them develop into females. There are 7 generations per year. All right, so when we talk about these 7 generations, we're talking about a time frame of 1 year. And you can see the number of eggs being made and the number, if they all survive, the number that you're going to have. All right, is just phenomenal. This is called biotic potential. Okay? Obviously, they do not reach biotic potential, thank goodness. Any questions there? Hopefully not. Okay, we're getting there. You're getting close. Since they cannot reach biotic potential, the population growth is going to slow down. When is it going to slow down? It's going to start slowing down when they start and begin to get close to the carrying capacity. So you got your characteristic J curve coming up like this, and then they start reaching the carrying capacity where they start feeling environmental resistance. There's limited resources. Okay? There's predators. There's all kinds of problems that occur out in the environment, so you end up slowing down their population growth and creating something called an S curve. Right? And they stay right around carrying capacity in general. And this is a very general term. Okay? In your particular graph, you can see the S curve, but what you don't have is this smooth, nice line here right at carrying capacity. All right? And that's what you need to look at. So you can see this would have been without any type of environmental resistance. That would have been your biotic potential growth. But now you have this S curve growth. And so that means all this area right here happens to be some sort of environmental resistance as a result of some kind of factor in the environment.